Welcome back to the Connected podcast. I'm thrilled to bring you an extraordinary collection in which some incredible students take the driver's seat and host dynamic conversations with professionals from across the higher education sector, discussing the vital topic of student belonging. Bringing our Voices of Belonging series to a close is student host Callum Perry, who is talking to the wonderful David Gilani. David works at Middlesex University in London as the Head of Student Engagement and Advocacy. David has also recently completed his part-time doctorate at the University of York, researching student belonging. And I think anybody who knows David sees him as a real leading light in this field. Our final episode is a bit of a showstopper, and I hope you will all enjoy the last instalment in our extraordinary Voices of Belonging collection.
I always start off our podcast discussions with asking you quite a broad question, I suppose, and hopefully we can delve into some of the nuances around that. But what does student belonging in the context of higher education mean for you based on the work that you've been doing, the context that you're in, and why is that really critical for student success, do you think?
I think for me, student belonging is about a recognition by the sector, those of us working in higher education, that the student experience isn't some objectively externally defined thing. It's how students feel about the experience. So that's kind of the first part of it. Student belonging is always about a sense of belonging. It is that subjective element from students. And I think it's a helpful way for us to all think about how different students will need and want different things of their experience at university. And ultimately, that's why we see student belonging being described so differently when it is researched. I think the key commonalities to try and avoid it being just this completely intangible, subjective, impossible to define thing. The things that come up for me whenever I've looked at this, either in my own research or the many bits of research that have been done by others on student belonging, is it's about safety, it's about connection, it's about being able to be one's true self, that kind of idea of belonging being actually opposite to fitting in. It's not about a student having to put on a front or hide parts of their identity. It's about them being able to act and be as their true authentic self at university and to feel valued for it. And so I think those things, when students do feel those things, they do feel that sense of belonging, that means that we are considering what that individual student needs. And ultimately, that's why that then tends to link to so many different aspects of student success, which we're all driving towards.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stood out for me as you were talking was around the individualized nature of belonging, and that when you've met one student and you've understood how they might belong, you've met one student that maybe it's not a homogenous experience for each individual student. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about how some of those nuances or disparities in our understanding of belonging affect where research is going and where the gaps might be for understanding belonging, given the nuances and the disparities within student experiences of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I think that the global higher education community has done a wonderful job in trying to ensure that we are looking at this topic from a very wide range of historically or currently underrepresented and minoritized perspectives. There are fantastic pieces of research out there looking at the experiences of Black students kind of at universities where they are still minoritized, students with autism, gay students. There is such a broad variety of research that looks at kind of what it means to be a student who has either still currently is underrepresented in their university and so doesn't find it as easy to find peers that share their identity or staff who they can identify with, or even in some cases, universities kind of like Middlesex were actually a very broad, widening participation type of institution where those, quote unquote, historically underrepresented students actually can very easily find peers like themselves. But at the same time, there is still that aspect of historical underrepresentation. As a university, it's very hard to get away from the ways we've built up an institution that at one point in time was catering to kind of the global minority students, as we would call them now. So there's still something, I think, there around getting that difference, that balance right between historically and currently underrepresented students, which is really interesting to do when we're looking at that. More broadly, I'd say, though, I think one of the things which I still see as a gap in the research around this is okay, there's that great first step, recognizing that different students will have different needs depending on their identities, backgrounds, their goals, but also recognizing that we as people and our students change constantly throughout our lives, especially during a time like going to university. And so I think one of the things I still see missing quite a lot is methods of research which recognize that dynamic nature of belonging and look at how it changes over time, and don't try to capture a snapshot of belonging just at one point and then think that's going to stay the same for students. I think when research is able to include that nuance for kind of that changing dynamic nature of belonging, when it is able to use perhaps longitudinal methods, it shows, I think, a much closer representation of that real experience for students.
Yeah, and I think it's, you're right, it's leaning into perhaps some of the messiness around understanding this area, and also trying to capture the lived experiences of students in its most authentic and truest form. And you talked about longitudinal research there. I wonder whether you've got any other insights around what the future directions of research methods might be for student belonging, and how else do you think we might be able to capture those lived experiences of students so authentically?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a debate which still exists that I've seen kind of play out around whether we're able to, quantitatively capture a sense of belonging. So, there's a huge number of different scales, validator scales that have been developed by people to try and get one way of quantifying student sense of belonging at university. Some people who still think they are, fundamentally flawed as a concept, but many others that are using it. And obviously that gives a way to be able to provide students a way to be able to, in some way that can be then tracked over time, to quantify their sense of belonging across different domains and different aspects. So I think seeing that debate play out, there's certainly something there. The other thing which I suppose I've seen recently from some of my own research, which I think is quite interesting, is this idea of the observer effect, and the ways in which, if we are asking students to reflect on their sense of belonging, we are almost guaranteed to influence their sense of belonging in some way, providing students with that space to be reflective, to ponder that topic. When we did this online diaries method piece of research with students over the last few years, where they would, on a regular basis throughout the year, write or leave a voice note or do a video recording where they would talk about their sense of belonging. At the end of that research project, we asked them about what impact just being part of the project had had on their sense of belonging. And the vast majority, I think it was 83%, said, yeah, I could see how it positively affected my own sense of belonging, just having that space. They talked about the ability to create a narrative that helped them realize how far they'd come, kind of the journey they'd been on. They talked about a way to be able to kind of put positive words to things which they might have felt but not really reflected on much before. They talked about how it was just a useful skill, kind of that reflective practice, which helped them in other aspects of their degrees. So I think for me, there's definitely something about getting this balance between large scale belonging research that helps us understand what it's like for our students across a whole cohort, whether that's in a subject or a whole university, versus being able to design methods which give students a bit more space to really be able to reflect on the topic, which in itself might be an intervention of sorts. They might find that useful for their sense of belonging, even if it's not then researching some other intervention or piece of action research they were putting into place.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering how that translates then just thinking about the research methods that you're talking about there, and allowing space almost as you say, as an intervention for students to reflect on their belonging and those experiences. How does that translate itself into kind of curriculum and wider student experience and support? Because I mean, our own institution, even here at UEA, we've been involved in work around kind of course level belonging and what it means to belong to your course. And there's something in there that you were talking about around reflection and opportunities to see yourself within what you're experiencing, that almost needs to be brought into curriculum and assessment and learning and teaching. So where's the transferability, do you think, around some of those ideas into those spaces?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. There are so many potential points to kind of see those connections, or unfortunately, to miss out on a duplicate if you're not seeing it in that way. So I would look at things like what strategies we have in our subjects and our universities around student voice. If we are collecting feedback from students, whether that be module evaluation survey type feedback or more kind of traditional like national student survey type work, are we treating those as you give us this data so we can do useful things with it, or are we treating it like a reflective exercise? This is a chance for you to be able to take stock on the skills you've developed, the confidence that's been changing over time as you've been doing this work on this module, to be able to reflect on what you've put into it and what you've got out of it. I think if you can get the tone right in that student voice work, it links really closely with student belonging. It's literally providing students with a bit of a space to reflect on what the journey has been like for them up to that point. And again, this kind of gets that then ability to let students reflect on what is it that they themselves would want to do differently perhaps in the future versus what is it that they would like us to do differently in the future, which then brings up a whole question around, who has responsibility for student belonging and how much is on the individual student themselves and how much is it on us when we're creating the learning environments that we do. So yeah, student voice is certainly one side of it. I guess the other is assessment as well. A lot of subjects try to build in some form of reflective practice alongside assessments. Again, that is going to provide an opportunity for students to be able to reflect on their journey and how that affects their sense of belonging over time. So that feels like another area where, again, if we can get it right and see it connected closely rather than something extra to be done, then this work on student belonging doesn't have to be done in addition to the course. It could be rooted more fundamentally through it. So those are kind of two immediate areas that come to mind. But even from the very beginning, I think, when a course leader is welcoming students on the very first day for their subject, asking students to reflect on, why they're here, what made them want to come to university in the first place, what journey they're on, what their aspirations are beyond university. I think that those are all questions of identity and, helping students to reflect on individually what they want to get out of their time there. And the thing to balance there, I suppose, is being able to help students recognize that they will probably have other students who have similar or shared goals as them in some areas, but also in some ways they will be the only student who has that particular background or aspiration about where they want to go next. And so it's being able to connect up where there are similarities, but also be able to reassure students that as it's individual and different for everyone, you don't need to just follow the same path as the student to your left or right if you have different belonging needs or aspirations of what you want to get out of your time at university.
Yeah, you mentioned that in there about who's helping to facilitate this, who's leading on these areas, and so I suppose it's only right that we talk about staff's roles within facilitating and supporting belonging. And I wonder whether you've got any insights into what staff might need to consider and who's involved and what type of actions might they be taking, particularly because I think we're talking about individuals' lived experiences, the kind of holistic nature of student experience, which draws on a wide range of different stakeholders within the university. And I don't know whether or not colleagues across the institutions in different areas and departments always have an understanding of what belonging means and how their roles link into that. So can you just sort of tease out a little bit around staff experiences and then staff roles and responsibilities?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is so important for me that a university is doomed to fail if every stakeholder in this setting thinks that student belonging is someone else's responsibility. If every student thinks, oh, it's not on me, it's on my course tutor to be able to do this different thing. If a professional service staff member thinks, oh, it's not on me, it's on the executive to do it. The thing we need to get to is a place where it's simple enough that everyone knows the bit they can contribute to. And based on the findings of the research I've seen, there are plenty of things which can contribute to or detract from students' sense of belonging. And so there is enough to share around in terms of things which everyone can take responsibility for. There is so much good research which shows this very close connection. I think a reciprocal connection between student engagement in terms of just their actual participation in the learning environment and beyond, and student belonging. It can form a virtuous upward spiral if you can get going in the right direction, where students' participation, attendance, contribution to classes will beget further student belonging, which then makes it easier for them to engage in the future. So that feels like something which we should make very clear. Some students will get that, will understand that right from the beginning, but if we make it explicit, if we have that conversation with students and tell them what bits they can take responsibility for, that'll put them in a place to know that that's what's expected of them. I was at an event last year with a student who was invited to be part of this panel discussion about student engagement, and staff from the university were talking about this student engagement crisis. And the student said, "This is the first time I've ever heard there's a student engagement crisis. We're just turning up when we can. Sometimes we have other priorities and such. If we can make it more explicit for students what is expected of them and the ways in which we think they can help through their activities," and I think that's really important. For any staff who is student facing, there is also plenty of evidence just around the positive impact we can make, the ways in which we can make a student feel like they matter through basic just behavioral things, from having high expectations of students, caring about their goals, being accessible, responding to emails. It's not a wild fantasy list. It's all kind of just basic things that we know are within our control, most of the time, to be able to make a difference to the people in front of us. To professional services staff, there is so much research which looks at these different touch points that students have through their journey and the ways in which that they will feel a greater sense of belonging when they can feel that there is wraparound support from the wider institution that they're part of. So again, whilst I think belonging fundamentally often starts and will have its strongest kind of attachment within the classroom, it's not that professional services staff can't have contributions to this as well by any means.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was going to talk about with you is this kind of idea of co-creation, which I think continues to be sort of a buzzword around staff-student relationships. But what you're saying there around being more explicit with students about what they can do and what they should do, and that and encouraging that agency, I think puts a whole entirely different spin on co-creation, because we often talk about moving away from tokenistic engagement to meaningful engagement, but actually none of that work is impactful if we're not fundamentally communicating to students about what that looks like and how we're going to enable them to do that. So there's almost a step which we're missing, where students have got to recognise and feel valued and have that sense of importance to enable them to actually then start to meaningfully engage with the structures that we put in place.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's a tension and it's a balance. Like the way I've come to frame it, which I think makes most sense, at least for me, is getting this balance right between agency, making sure that students know what they can have responsibility for, what they can do, but also not gaslighting students into thinking that they themselves can overcome institutional systemic barriers. There will be times where you've got to be really careful about saying to students, if you just attended more, you'd have a greater sense of belonging. If you're saying it to a student who lives on campus, who comes from perhaps a well-supported family background, so they don't need to work a part-time job, compared to a student who's only able to come to campus once or twice a week because they're working so many hours and they live quite far away. All of those different things, we've got to be careful that we're not putting the onus entirely on students. But at the same time, I am cautious that as a sector, we've potentially moved too far away from that idea of putting the responsibility to some extent back on students, which risks just basically leaving them out of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think it goes directly back to what you were saying earlier, doesn't it, about understanding your individual students' needs and experiences, and how your role and how your approach or interventions contribute to those meaningful lived experiences, or that personalized nature of understanding students and what they need and how they might go about experiencing things that we perhaps just take for granted, that we think maybe a homogenous group of students may well experience. Which I suppose is a challenge in higher education for some, isn't it, about how do we get that personalized sense of support and experience in such large institutions. And I wonder whether we can say with some level of certainty that there are certain things that work for belonging. Would you say, from the work that you've done and the literature that you are engaged with, that there are things that we know we should be doing to help contribute to belonging?
Yeah. I mean, the things that come to mind for me, at highest level, I think there is a responsibility on all of us as staff, but especially leaders within universities, to recognise that personalised approach is only possible when staff aren't overworked to the point where they don't have any time to be physically with their students. So I think there is definitely something about just that fundamental point. But for example, I've seen great case studies of pre-arrival questionnaires that then have automated personalized action plans created for students based on what they tell us at that point in the journey that they are, what's the reason they're coming to university, what more information they want on different topics. So being able to tailor things like that. Also at that point in time, that's a great point where you could ask students about what their overall career aspirations are for university, so that you can then build your employability support as an institution around what that cohort, more importantly, which each individual student is saying they want to get out of their time at university, especially for the students who say in their first year they don't know what they want to do yet. Well, then that's a great cohort of students to catch early on and to provide space for them to have conversations to explore different options, rather than go through until in their third year and then they're like, oh no, I still don't really know what I want to get out of this. I think there's some really great case studies and increasingly evidence that's coming out about the importance of building academic societies. So thinking about that peer-to-peer connection, but within the course of study. I do think when students are talking about belonging in research that I've seen, there is a difference between peers on the course and peers in broader areas. Not to say that one is more important than the other, but I don't think I've really ever met many students who don't say that belonging within their course environment isn't important to them, whereas for some students, those other wider areas won't be as important from the start at least. So I think the work in that is really important. There's lots of different things, and I know that there is a great set of communities of practice, edited collections, evidence repositories where more people are being able to share these case studies so that we can learn what's working and also what is being tried but actually isn't necessarily leading to the impact that people had been hoping for, so that others can then learn from that and build on it in the future.
Yeah, excellent. I'm conscious of time and I know that we could continue talking, but I was wondering whether we could now sort of, as we're entering the kind of final few minutes of our discussion, think about future directions and recommendations. So for those that are listening that are interested in research or practice around belonging, where do you think research needs to go moving forward, and what do you think colleagues could take away from this discussion to think about in their own institutions?
No, that's a really helpful question. It's a nice one to be able to contribute something to, so thank you. So going back to a few things we've discussed already, I think certainly around longitudinal research methods, research that looks at how things change over time for students, research which is giving students more space to reflect, to be able to see research as not being something which needs to be clinical and separated from interventions, but to create research which might be supportive for students in itself, I think is something I'm really optimistic about appearing more and more going forwards. Research which looks at postgraduate students is really it's not out there nearly as much as it is for undergraduate students. Research which looks at belonging beyond just the first year experience more broadly, I think is something which is really needed to try and help understand those later stages of undergraduate student journeys. So those are just a few areas where I certainly think, looking through what's out there at the moment, I noticed if we had more on this, it would be really helpful to be able to go beyond, I think, where the majority of the research is covered so far.
Excellent. And in terms of practice then, and colleagues that are thinking about, maybe the new academic year and what they could be doing over the summer now to be thinking about, building belonging for students as they come back in September, are there any key things that you would be doing at this time of year to prepare for that new start in September?
Yeah, absolutely. I think your institutional approach to welcome, get belonging right from the start, I think understand where your students are coming from. So think about pre-arrival questionnaires, what do they call it? Career readiness questions at the beginning of students' journeys. Why are they coming to university? So you can then base your support and interventions around what the students trying to get out of their time there. Have a welcome strategy. At Middlesex, our goals are to connect students to their program, their peers, and the university from the beginning. So structuring activities which facilitate that. Ask yourself and the staff that you work with directly, what are we building into our behaviours so that we can help each student that we see feel like they matter? So what does that look like in terms of accessibility, being caring and supporting of students, And there's some good research, which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested, around trying to kind of build that into almost like a bit of a set of values which people can act by. The other areas which I think I really want to see universities doing more with practically around belonging is tying it into academic advising interventions and learner analytics support. So this connection between looking at students' engagement data and going back to what I was saying before, seeing it as being a reciprocal relationship between engagement and belonging. When we can see engagement is going up, in a lot of cases, I think we can see that as a positive sign that students' sense of belonging will be going up. Where are the areas where we can see negative changes in engagement, and where are those essentially showing us opportunities to put in place belonging interventions to support students? I think there's definitely something very interesting there, which I hope more universities are going to be able to explore practically.
Brilliant. I think that's a really good place to kind of summarise our conversations. David, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting to talk to you. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Callum. Really enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Connected podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out the rest of our extraordinary Voices of Belonging collection and stay connected.